Hey everybody, it's Pastor Jason standing here in our sanctuary behind what we've called our praise team spit shields. You know, if only a few months ago you told me that our praise team would be singing behind these shields every week, or that our sanctuary seating would be spaced apart in order to socially distance ourselves from each other, or that these face masks would be part of our everyday attire, well, I think I'd have no other choice but to tell you that you're crazy. Then again, if you were to tell me that there would come a day when church buildings would close their doors for several months, I think that you were absolutely out of your mind. Who would have thought back on December 31st, as we were looking forward to the year 2020, you know, that perfect vision year, as folks would call it? Who would have thought back then, as we were ending one year and preparing to open a new one, that the new year would look the way that it's looked just now? Who would have ever thought back then that a pandemic would sweep its way through our country, not just our country, but through the world? And then again, who would have thought that in the midst of that pandemic, we'd see riots and protests and racism and burning buildings and all of the things that we've seen in recent weeks and recent months? No one really could have ever seen what was coming in our direction. And if we're honest with ourselves, there really hasn't been much let up, has there? I mean, it would have been something, right, if we had gone through the pandemic and had just a little breather, and then entered what we've been seeing on the news and had a little breather, and then entered whatever it was that was coming next and had another breather. But the reality is there hasn't been much breathing time in between anything. And add to the pandemic, add to all of the things that we've seen unfolding in our country and really around the world, are the various things that we all go through in our own personal lives. Things like health crises, unexpected surgeries, or loss of job, or struggle with finances, or an underlying depression really at full speed ahead. The reality is that all of us have been, and many of us still are, going through what might go down as the absolute weirdest and most difficult year of our lives. I often think that there's going to come a day down the road when many of us will look back at 2020, scratch our heads, and ask the question, what was that all about? That was absurd. What a strange year that ended up being. Who would have ever thought on December 31st that we'd be exactly where we are in the middle of July? You know, today I want to share just a few thoughts with you as I stand by our spit shield, as I think about these face masks, and as I look out over this sanctuary, limited number of chairs and spaced out as they are in order to ensure that 6 feet apart guideline that we need to adhere to. Let me just first say that I am so excited every Sunday morning when I see folks coming through the doors of this building. And yet my heart still longs for that day when all of us will be back together again under this roof. Technology's great. Facebook provides opportunities to be able to live stream worship services or prayer gatherings or other things that we've seen over these past few months. YouTube has been wonderful to be able to link to our website so that those who are not here in person and those who aren't on Facebook can still be able to see and participate in the Sunday morning worship services. But still, there is nothing quite like being together. Nothing like seeing each other's face. Well, at least half of it anyway. Nothing like an in-person greeting or being able to stand in the sanctuary and hear the voices of those who are singing nearby you. There's nothing like being together. And I know that for some of you watching this, you're really struggling with the idea of returning. Some of you that are watching this right now, you have a compromised immune system. You might have some health concerns, and you might be leery about returning because of your immunity, because of your health concerns. We understand that. Some of you might be hesitant in returning because you are really fearful of this pandemic. You're really anxious about getting out there, not only to a weekly worship service, but perhaps you're really struggling in going out to the grocery store, or struggling going out to your workplace, or struggling going out anywhere for that matter. And perhaps for some of you, you had that underlying anxiety before, and now your anxiety level, it seems like it is full throttle ahead. Some of you that may have had bouts of depression before, you find that now you seem to be living in a state of constant depression, where getting up in the morning, getting your 2 feet on the floor each morning really seems like a task that is, well, too unattainable, perhaps. Some of you may not be returning for other reasons. And maybe some of you watching this, you're even struggling with your own faith, with your own walk with the Lord. And maybe this whole pandemic, followed by riots and burning buildings and all of the things that we've seen, maybe you're just in a spot where you're questioning right now. Or you're in a spiritual desert, or spiritual valley, as we say. And so you're kind of scratching your head a little bit and saying, man, do I want to go back? Should I go back? Will I go back? Well, I hope that your answer is yes. I'm going back. I'm getting back to weekly worship with my church family. You know, I'm often reminded of what the author of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 10. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage each other all the more as we see the day approaching. You know, the fact of the matter is that there has never existed a time in the history of this church, or the church for that matter, that has been anything like what we've seen. I don't remember a time in the church's history when doors of church buildings have been closed for months at a time. Oh, sure, we close for snow days and things like that, hurricanes or whatever that might knock on our doors. But to close for several months and then to reopen wearing face masks and social distancing and having to ask people not to shake each other's hands or give each other a hug, I can't remember a day like that. I have certainly never pastored a church through a season like that. In fact, a good friend of mine, he and I have chatted so many times throughout this, and we've often asked each other the same question: what is going on? And how are we supposed to pastor in a season that is so bizarre and so unlike any other that we as pastors or we as churches have ever seen before? But yet I'm also convinced, I'm absolutely certain, that on December 31st, as we were approaching the end of one year and getting ready to open a new one, on December 31st, as none of us could ever anticipate anything like this, in 2020. God saw the entire thing. God knew about this pandemic. God knew about all of the things that would unfold in our country, in our world, and in our own individual lives. God saw everything. Now, some might say, well, if God saw everything, why didn't God stop everything? If God saw the pandemic coming, why didn't God stop it before it ever started? If God saw protests, if God saw burning buildings, if God saw division starting to creep up, even among his people in areas like politics and other things, why didn't God stop it? I mean, he's God, he's sovereign. He can end things even before those things begin. Why wouldn't God have ended that? Well, that would open up the conversation of free will, and that would take us a long time to go through. You see, God does allow things to happen. Much like Joseph and his brothers in the Old Testament. If anybody had lousy siblings, it was Joseph. Trading them for slavery, dropping them in a ditch, leaving them for dead. And yet at the end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 50, as Joseph is now standing face to face with his brothers, who are apologetic and wondering what Joseph is about to do to them, he simply turns and looks at them and gives them these words. You see, what you meant for evil, God used for good. Yes, God saw what was coming in 2020. Absolutely none of this caught him by surprise. But I also know that what could be meant for evil, what could be meant to destroy, to distract, to derail, God can use it for good. Much like Paul says in Romans chapter 8, that God works all things, not some things, not a few things, not selective things, but God works all things together to the good of those who love him and who've been called according to his glorious purpose. You know, one of my favorite scenes in the New Testament always involves Jesus and his disciples out at the beach. I don't know why it is, but I love reading anything that has to do with Jesus and the 12 out on the water or walking on the seashore together. I just love that picture. In fact, one of my favorites of all is Matthew chapter 14, the account of the disciples out on the boat one night. And as the Bible says, their boat is buffeted by the wind and the waves. And you remember the story. Peter sees Jesus walking on the water and calls out from the boat, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Tell me to get out of the boat and walk on water. Well, Jesus does just that. He says, Peter, come. And you know, Peter gets out of the boat. He begins to walk on water. And suddenly he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he plants them on the wind and the waves. And he begins to sink. He cries out, Lord, save me. And the Bible says the best word of all is immediately. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, held Peter's arm, pulled him back up, got in the boat with Peter, and said, Why did any of you doubt that it was me, you of little faith? You know, the very first sermon I ever preached was when I was in high school. I forget how old I was, but I preached one night. And I preached on Matthew chapter 14. And it still remains my favorite chapter of the New Testament to preach on. Jesus walking out on the water, Peter taking his eyes off of Jesus and putting them on the things that surrounded him, the stormy waters and the rough wind, and beginning to sink, yet saved by the grip of the grace of Jesus Christ. You know, no doubt, we're in a storm, aren't we? The pandemic storm, the political landscape, the protests and so forth. We're in a storm. And you might be in your own individual storm right now. I know I've gone through various storms within this period of time. Regardless of how you perceive this pandemic, it is a pandemic. It has thrown us off kilter. It has caused several their lives, their security, and it has hurt people physically, emotionally, and in some cases spiritually. We are in a storm. And as I think about Matthew chapter 14, it says that the boat in which the disciples were in was buffeted by the wind and the waves that were against it. The storm was pushing the disciples further and further out to sea. And some translations also tell us that the disciples, fishermen, trained fishermen, tried their very best to row against the storm. And they were tired. They gave it all their might, all their strength, all their energy, trying to push against the storm, trying to push against the waves that I imagine at that time were beginning to crash up on their boat, perhaps even ruining some of their sails. And pushing against the storm only wore them out. And pushing against the storms in our lives can surely tire us out more than we can ever begin to imagine. But there are a few things in Matthew 14 that I learn and that I embrace every time I read that chapter. The first is this: God is never afraid of our storms. God's not afraid of a pandemic. He's not afraid of protests and burning buildings and all of the destruction that we see out there. He's aware of it, and he's not afraid of it. You see, God doesn't run into another room when he sees something coming our way. He sees it before it happens. And he gives us his strength as it unfolds. He is not afraid of storms. The second thing is that he's also not afraid to come to us in those storms. You see, God's not just seated up on some big chair in heaven, watching down and seeing how everything is going to unfold. No, the Bible says that he is near to the brokenhearted. He binds up their wounds. He goes before us and behind us. He hems us in. He is our rock and our refuge, an ever-present help in our time of trouble. God is serious about moving closer towards us. And on a night when the storms are raging, when the seas are rough and the wind is howling at its best, Jesus walks out on stormy seas to meet his friends, to meet the 12. And whatever storm you might be going through today, whatever storm I might be going through, whatever storm the church might be going through, Jesus is still in the business of walking on water. Now, sometimes we, like Peter, take our eyes off of Jesus, and we put him on all the storminess that surrounds us, whether it is on a national level, on a world level, or on a personal level. It's easy for us to focus on those things. I know it is for me anyways. And sometimes, like Peter, the more we take our eyes off of Jesus, the deeper our feet begin to sink in the storm in which we find ourselves. But if we, like Peter, call out in the midst of that storm, "Lord, I need you. Lord, save me," then immediately Jesus reaches out his hand and grabs hold of us. The grip of grace, which is the grip of love and the grip of mercy and the grip of strength. If we call out to him, if we recognize that we've taken our eyes off of him, and there he is, waiting for us to call out. You know, maybe today you're feeling like your boat has been buffeted by the wind and the waves. Well, can I assure you that sometimes storms have a way of also bringing us deeper into relationship and fellowship with Jesus Christ. So many storms in my life, I see how God used those to bring me deeper in fellowship with Him, in a sweeter and more intimate relationship with the God who loves me and who holds me with the grip of grace. You see, yes, storms can push us, but God desires and delights in using those storms to draw us closer to Him. That's why He meets us there. That's why He delights in walking closer to us when everything else around us seems to be crumbling. Friends, don't allow your storms, whether personal or whether the storm that we have found ourselves in over these few months, don't allow those storms to be bigger than the one who walks out on the water towards you in the midst of them. Don't do it. Don't allow your questions to ever become greater than the answer being Jesus Christ. Don't let your fear and your anxiety or your depression or your uneasiness ever become more important than the one who can hold you, bind up your wounds, and assure you that He is aware and He is still awesome. I am hoping and praying that you will come back. You know, I stand on that altar every Sunday morning and I look out and I see those who are sitting here and oh, my heart rejoices. But at the same time, my heart grieves because I know that we still have others who are not yet here with us. Those of you with health concerns, I get it. But those of you who might be anxious, nervous, fearful, those of you who might be in a depression, in a valley, in a desert, and I welcome you to come back home. Don't let the wind take you so far out. Don't let the waves become so big that you fail to see the Jesus who can bring them all under control and cause them to be still. Friends, I love you. And I look forward to the day when you're back here. And for those of you who have followed us on Facebook, you know, I know when all of this started, we had over 1,000 people who were watching the weekly worship services or the prayer gatherings or whatever it was that we put out there. You know, maybe the pandemic isn't at the height that it was months ago. I want to invite you, rekindle that flame, that relationship that you had with the Lord. Don't let it be based on a pandemic. Don't let it be based on a difficult moment. Let it be based solely on the love that God has for you and the way that He has made through Jesus Christ to have a relationship with you. So our doors are going to be open on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. And I'd love to see you. But more than anything, I'd love it if all of us were to see Jesus instead of the storm that surrounds us. I love you. God loves you. Father, thank you. Thank you for Jesus. We love you, God. We thank you for holding us in the grip of amazing grace. To God be all the glory, honor, and praise. We love you. And we thank you and pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you, my friends. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And remember, we're here for you.